I was clinically dead for 12 minutes and saw records no hospital can keep. What I discovered shattered my 15-year-old atheism. My name is Francisco Jimenez, and for 15 years my white coat was my armor against the invisible. I was born in Zone 7 of Guatemala City, in a humble home where the sound of tortillas being patted out competed each morning with my mother's loud prayers before the altar of the Virgin of Guadalupe. From childhood, I learned that there were two religions in my family, my mother's devout Catholicism, which lit candles for every need, and my own scientific faith, which only believed in what I could verify with my own eyes. I remember the exact day I decided to become a nurse. I was 12 years old when my younger brother, Carlitos, almost died of dengue fever. While Mum wept on her knees before St. Jude Thaddeus, I watched as the nurses at the hospital monitored every vital sign, adjusted for fluids, and recorded data on life-saving charts. It wasn't prayers that brought Carlitos back from the brink of death, it was blood transfusions often, antipyretics, and constant monitoring. That was my first lesson. Faith doesn't cure, medicine does. Yes, by 2020, I was the head nurse of the intensive care unit at Roosevelt Hospital, the largest in Guatemala. 15 years of experience had made me what my colleagues called the Iron Captain. I was never late, I never made mistakes with medication dosages, and I had a golden rule that all the staff knew. In my unit, prayers, holy cards, and holy water were not allowed. This is a hospital, not a church, I would say whenever I caught a new nurse crossing herself before entering a room. My relationship with Mom had grown strained over the years. Every Sunday, without fail, she would call me after Mass. "Francisca, my daughter, when are you going back to church? I pray every day for your soul," she would say in that broken voice that tried to make me feel guilty. I would sigh, looking out the window of my apartment in Zone 10, that small space I had bought with my own hard work, without divine help, just with double shifts and sacrifice. "Mom, I already told you I don't need an invisible God, I need evidence, science, verifiable facts," I would reply, knowing those words stung like needles, but I couldn't lie to her, or to myself. For me, God was just a collective placebo, a psychological crutch for those who couldn't face the harsh reality of existence. March 2020 arrived like an invisible tsunami. The word COVID-19 began to be repeated on every news program, in every hospital meeting. At first, I saw it as just another medical challenge. I had faced dengue epidemics, H1N1 influenza outbreaks, cholera cases in rural areas. This would be no different, I thought. We were trained professionals, we had protocols, personal protective equipment, science would protect us. But I was wrong. In a matter of weeks, Roosevelt Hospital became a battlefield. The hallways smelled of disinfectant mixed with the palpable fear of entire families waiting for news. Intensive care units multiplied, occupying surgical areas and wards. From recovery to the hallways, I worked 18-hour shifts, sleeping barely 4 in the break rooms, eating a cold chip island tamale that some colleagues shared when I could. My uniform was now an astronaut suit, a gown waterproof suit, double N95 mask, face shield, double gloves, cap, and yet we watched young, strong patients die, people who just a week before had been running a marathons or selling vegetables at the market terminal. What irritated me most was seeing how, amidst the scientific chaos, religion seeped in through every crack. Families begged permission to bring priests to administer last rites. Intubated patients had rosaries wrapped around their hands. Young nurses wept in the locker rooms and told me, "Chief, only God can save us now." I gritted my teeth and answered firmly, "No, what will save us is following the protocols to the letter, not contaminating the equipment, and staying focused. Leave God out of this." I have to admit something I've never confessed to anyone. Despite my militant atheism, there were moments, especially in the early mornings when I closed the eyes of a patient who had just died, when I felt something strange. It wasn't exactly guilt, it was more like an uncomfortable question floating in my mind: what if there's something more? What if these patients who murmured "Jesus, receive me," in their last breaths, They saw something I couldn't measure, but I quickly drowned those doubts with logic. They were hallucinations due to lack of oxygen, final neuronal discharges, nothing more. Death was simply the cessation of biological functions, end of story. There was one patient who particularly touched me, Don Julio Mendizabal, a 72-year-old man who had been a school teacher in Quetzaltenango his entire life. He arrived at my unit with an oxygen saturation of 60%, bilateral pneumonia. Prognosis guarded. His wife, Doña Petrona, couldn't enter due to the restrictions, but every day she sent a small bag with holy cards of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and a handwritten letter with a security guard. I threw them straight in the trash. Unnecessary contamination, I said, but Don Julio, even with his high-flow oxygen mask, looked at me with those tired brown eyes and said, "Nurse Francisca, do you believe in God?" I adjusted his monitor and answered curtly, "Don Julio, I believe in medicine. Focus on taking deep breaths." On April 30, 2020, a Thursday I'll never forget, I started my shift feeling strange. I had a persistent headache, but I attributed it to exhaustion and the 20 hours I'd worked the day before. I took 2 ibuprofens with a strong black coffee that Vilma, the nursing assistant who always arrived with Pandembuto from the Central Market, made for me. During the morning, I attended to 7 critical patients. I adjusted 3 ventilators and had to break the news to a family that their 50-year-old father hadn't survived. Protocol, professional composure, efficiency, that's how I operated. But at midday, while checking Don Julio's vital signs, I felt the room spin. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, my throat burned as if I'd swallowed glass. I was exhausted. I touched my forehead over my face shield. It was burning hot. Pilma looked at me worriedly. "Chief, you're pale," she said. I shook my head. Pure stubbornness. "I'm fine, I just need water." But I wasn't fine. As I walked toward the nursing station, my legs trembled. The dry cough started, that cough I already recognized in every patient who came in. The pulse oximeter read 88% saturation. My lungs felt like they were filled with cement. The head nurse on duty, Drive, Morales, saw me and knew immediately. "Francisca, you've infected, you have to isolate yourself now." I wanted to protest, to argue that I had patients who depended on me, that I couldn't abandon my post, but the scientific truth was undeniable. I had become just another statistic of this relentless virus. They gave me an emergency PCR test and sent me home with strict instructions. I drove my little Toyota Yaris on Roosevelt Avenue, seeing the city through a feverish haze. I got to my apartment, closed the door, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt real fear. Not spiritual fear, but biological, visceral fear, the terror of knowing exactly how this disease works, what it does to the lungs. How it can take you from life to death in a matter of days. I called my mom. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been expecting my call. "Mom, I got the virus," I told her. I said, trying to sound strong, but my voice broke. There was silence on the other end, then the sound of a restrained "I'm here, daughter, I'm coming right now." "No, Mom, you can't come. I might infect you." "Then I'm going to pray, Francisca. I'm going to pray like I've never prayed before. I'm going to ask the Virgin Mary, St. Jude, all the saints." I wanted to tell her not to waste her time, that she should get me a portable oxygen tank instead. But all I could manage to say was, "Do what you want, Mom." That night, alone in my apartment, with my fever rising to 39 degrees Celsius, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the ceiling. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely powerless. All my science, all my knowledge, my 15 years of experience meant nothing against this microscopic enemy. I coughed so hard I felt my ribs would break. And at that moment, in the solitude of my room, a forbidden question crossed my mind: what if Mom is right? What if there really is a God? I shook my head angrily at myself for even considering that possibility. It was the fever, the desperation, nothing more. I forced myself to drink water and oxygen every hour. I documented my symptoms in a notebook like the scientist I was, but deep down, very deep down, Something inside me was beginning to crack. I didn't know it then, but that night was just the beginning of a journey that would shatter every certainty I had built up throughout my life. The next 48 hours were a free fall into the abyss of coughing. What began as a fever and a dry cough transformed into a medical nightmare that I myself had seen unfold in dozens of patients, but never imagined experiencing firsthand. The oxygen saturation I religiously measured every hour began to drop alarmingly. 90%, 87, 83, 79. My lungs felt as if someone had poured liquid concrete into them. Every breath was a battle I was losing. On Saturday morning, barely 2 days after arriving home, I woke up drenched in a cold sweat, unable to complete a sentence without gasping. I tried to get out of bed to go to the bathroom and my legs gave out. I fell to the floor of my room, staring at the cream-colored ceramic tiles that had cost me so much to pay for, thinking with bitter irony that perhaps I would die there alone, in the apartment I bought without divine intervention, only conscience and hard work. I managed to crawl to where I had left my phone and with trembling fingers dialed the emergency number for Roosevelt Hospital. I don't remember much of the ambulance ride, fragmented images, the sirens piercing the Guatemalan morning, the streets of the boulevard, the heroes blurred through my glassy eyes. The paramedic's voice repeated, "Hang on, Nurse Francisca, we're almost there." The irony was that this young man, Brian I think his name was, had been one of the patients I'd treated months before when he'd had a motorcycle accident. Now our roles had reversed, and I was the one lying on the stretcher with an oxygen mask at maximum flow pressed against my face. When I arrived at the I saw the looks on my colleagues' faces. I knew those expressions because I'd worn them myself hundreds of times. Professional concern mixed with the stark assessment of the odds of survival. Drive. Morales immediately ordered, red triage, shock room, prepare for intubation. I tried to shake my head. I wanted to say no, that I could still breathe on my own, but my oxygen saturation had dropped to 62%. The numbers don't lie. That had always been my philosophy, and the numbers dictated that I needed a ventilator. I would either become a mechanic or die in the next few minutes. They transferred me to the intensive care unit, my own unit, the kingdom I had ruled with an iron fist for years. From the gurney, I could see room number 7, where Don Julio Mendizabal was still fighting the virus. Vilma was beside me, holding my hand with her latex gloves, her teary eyes peering over her mask. "Boss, you're going to pull through. You're the strongest person I know," she said, her voice breaking. I wanted to answer her, tell her to check my vitals every hour, to review the sedation protocol, to notify Mom, but I no longer had the breath for words. Drive. Hernandez, an anesthesiologist with 20 years of experience, prepared the intubation equipment. I had seen him perform this procedure 1,000 times, but now it was my turn. He said, "Francisca, we're going to sedate you, count down from 10, he told me in that calm voice doctors use before inducing anesthesia. I looked at the white ceiling of the room, the surgical lights I had personally cleaned so many times to prevent infection, and started. 10, 9, 8, I didn't even get to 7. The next thing I remember is floating. I know it sounds absurd, irrational, completely unscientific, but I can't find any other way to describe it. I was floating near the ceiling of the intensive care unit, looking down at my own body lying on bed number 3. It was a surreal and terrifying image. I could see myself, my black hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, the light blue hospital gown with the Roosevelt logo, the endotracheal tube connected to the ventilator, the heart monitor wires attached to my chest. But what was most disturbing was the absolute calm with which I observed this scene. There was no panic, no pain, just an almost scientific curiosity about what I was witnessing. Drive. Hernandez adjusted the ventilator settings while Morales checked my blood pressure. Vilma wept silently by the door. I could see the clock on the wall. It read 11:42 a.m. At that moment, all the monitors began to beep stridently. The green line on the electrocardiogram that marked my heartbeats became a flat line accompanied by the continuous, high-pitched sound that any healthcare professional recognizes as the announcement of death, asystole. Cardiac arrest, code blue. I watched as my team, my colleagues, the people I had worked shoulder to shoulder with for years sprang into action with the precision of a choreography rehearsed 1,000 times. Drive. Hernandez began chest compressions, plunging his interlocked hands onto my sternum in cycles of 30 compressions. 1 2 3. He called out, drive. Morales prepared doses of epinephrine. A nurse I recognized as Marta brought the defibrillator, and I, from that impossible spot near the ceiling, observed everything with a clarity I had never experienced while alive. I could hear every word with a supernatural sharpness. Charge 200 joules. Drive. Morales ordered, everyone out. The sharp sound of the electric shock ripped through my inert body. The flatline continued. Another dose of a pick. Continue CPR. Drive. Hernandez was sweating. His chest compressions were so forceful that I later learnt it fractured 2 of my ribs, something completely normal in effective resuscitation, but at that moment I felt nothing. I was clinically dead, scientifically, undeniably dead. The clock read 11:45, 3 minutes of clinical death, then 6 minutes, then 9. I heard drive. Morales say in a low voice, Hernandez, we've been at it for almost 10 minutes. If he doesn't respond in the next 2, we have to consider. She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. After 12 minutes without oxygen, the brain suffers irreversible damage. Francisca Jimenez, the atheist nurse who only believed in science, would become just another statistic of the pandemic. But then something happened that no medical book, no scientific study, no neurological theory can explain. A light appeared in the upper corner of the room. It wasn't the white light of the hospital's LED lamps. It was a different light, golden, warm, alive. It pulsed with an intensity that should have blinded me, but instead drew me in like an irresistible magnet, and with that light came a presence. I can't describe it any other way. It was such an overwhelmingly powerful presence, so full of pure and absolute love, that my entire being, or what remained of my being in that strange state of disembodied existence, was drawn to it. I stopped seeing the intensive care unit. I stopped seeing my colleagues struggling to revive my lifeless body. Suddenly I was in a tunnel, but it wasn't dark, as they describe in the movies. It was luminous, filled with that golden light that seemed to emanate pure love in the form of photons. I was moving at an impossible speed and at the same time felt like I was floating in slow motion. I wasn't afraid. All my life I had feared the unknown, what I couldn't measure or explain, but in that moment there was no fear, only a peace that transcended any human emotion I had ever experienced. At the end of the tunnel, the light intensified until it became a figure, and even though I know this destroys every belief I've held for 37 years, even though I know it contradicts all my scientific training, even though my atheist nurse's mind screams that it's impossible, I have to tell the truth. It was Jesus. I don't know how I knew with such certainty. I just knew. It was him, the figure my mother adored in faded holy cards, the same one I had scorned as a myth invented by weak people who needed spiritual crutches. But there he was, real, solid, more real than anything I had ever touched in the physical world. His face radiated a beauty that wasn't physical, but spiritual. His eyes, a color that doesn't exist in the human visible spectrum, gazed at me with such profound love that I felt every cell of my being, or whatever it was that I was at that moment, melt before that gaze. He didn't speak with audible words, but I heard his voice deep within my consciousness. Francisca, my daughter, welcome home. I tried to respond. I tried to say there must be some mistake, that I didn't believe in him, that I had spent 15 years denying his existence, but before I could formulate a coherent thought, he extended his hand toward me, a hand with a visible scar on the palm, evidence of a crucifixion I had dismissed as a historical event with no divine significance, and when that hand touched what I might call my ethereal brow, my entire universe expanded. We left the tunnel of light and entered a space that defies all earthly description. It wasn't a physical place with measurable dimensions, but neither was it abstract. It was more real than reality itself. The air, if I can call it that, vibrated with a music that didn't come from instruments, but from existence itself. The colors were brighter, purer, more vibrant than anything I had ever seen under the Guatemalan sun, and before us, stretching to an impossible horizon, stood a majestic structure that Jesus identified with a single word that resonated within me: library. But it wasn't an ordinary library, it was the library of souls, and what I saw there would forever change every scientific certainty I had ever held as absolute truth. On the clock at Roosevelt Hospital, my heart had stopped beating for 11 minutes. I had 60 seconds before the brain damage would become irreversible, according to all medical protocols, but I was about to discover that human consciousness doesn't depend on the brain and that every second of our lives is recorded in eternal records that no laboratory can measure. The structure that stretched before me was impossible to describe with earthly vocabulary, but I will try because it is important that you understand what I saw. Imagine the grandest library you can conceive. Multiply its magnificence by 1,000 and you will still fall short. The walls were not made of brick or concrete, but of a crystalline substance that emanated its own light, changing from golden to silver to celestial blue hues. There was no visible ceiling, only an infinite expanse upward, where entire constellations seemed to swirl in cosmic dances, and the books, my God, the books were countless, millions, billions, spread across shelves that defied the laws of physics. I had studied so much. Jesus walked beside me, or rather we floated together. Because there was no walking as we know it, every movement was pure intention translated into displacement. Her presence radiated a peace that my scientific mind couldn't categorize. It was like being immersed in liquid love. If that made any sense, Francisca said, in that voice that didn't need sound waves to be heard. Here are kept the records of every soul that has existed, exists, and will exist, every thought, every intention, every act of love, every tear shed for another, every word of comfort whispered in secret. Nothing is lost, everything is recorded for eternity. My nurse's mind, that part of me that had spent 15 years measuring vital signs and analyzing lab results, rebelled against this information. But that's impossible, I thought. Consciousness is a product of neuronal synapses, of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, of measurable electrical impulses. When the brain dies, consciousness is extinguished. It's basic biology. Jesus looked at me with a smile that held infinite patience, the same expression I wore when a nursing student asked me something basic. And who told you that consciousness resides in the brain, my child? The brain is simply the receiver. Like a radio picks up waves that exist independently of it, consciousness is an eternal gift that I myself breathe into every soul at the moment of creation. He reached for one of the nearest bookshelves, and a book gently detached itself, floating toward us. It was a beautiful volume bound in what looked like leather, but it glowed with an inner light. On the cover, engraved in gold letters that pulsed with a life of their own, I read my full name, Francisco Alejandra Jimenez Morales. This is your book, Jesus said, the complete story of your life, every moment, from when your soul was conceived in the Father's mind until this precise instant when you are here with me, clinically dead in a bed at Roosevelt Hospital, while your colleagues desperately try to revive your heart. The book opened by itself and the pages began to turn at an impossible speed, but I could see every image, every scene, as if I were experiencing it all simultaneously. I saw my birth at San Juan de Dios Hospital, the exact moment my mother held me for the first time and cried tears of joy because I had survived a complicated delivery. I saw my baptism at the Church of Santo Domingo, where Mom dedicated me to Our Lady of Guadalupe with a ceremony that included our entire extended family eating chipilin tamales and drinking corn atole in my grandmother's backyard. I saw the day that Carlitos almost died of dengue fever, but now I saw something I hadn't noticed before. So, while I watched, fascinated, the nurse's work, Mom wasn't just praying, she was making a pact with God, promising to double her prayers if he saved her son, and she touched my heart, drawing me closer to faith. The pages kept turning, and I saw my teenage years, my college years, my graduation as a professional nurse. But what impacted me most was seeing scenes I had completely forgotten or had never paid attention to. I saw the day I'd brutally rejected a classmate who invited me to a spiritual retreat. Telling him in front of everyone, I'd rather spend my time studying real anatomy than religious fantasies. I saw the pain on his face, how those words scarred him because he was going through a crisis of faith, and my rejection only made it worse. I saw Mom crying alone in her room after our Sunday phone arguments, kneeling before her makeshift altar, praying with lit candles to every saint she knew. Lord, don't let my daughter die without knowing you. I'd rather die 1,000 times than lose her forever. Jesus stopped the pages on a specific date, August 17, 2019, almost a year before my death. Do you remember this day, Francisca? He asked. I watched the scene unfolding on the pages like a three-dimensional film. It was a night shift in intensive care. There was a new patient, Don Julio Mendizabal, the school teacher from Quetzaltenango I mentioned earlier. He had just been transferred from the emergency room, his lungs ravaged by severe bacterial pneumonia, struggling for every breath. His wife, Doña Petrona, had managed to get in for 5 minutes to say goodbye before I implemented the visiting restrictions. I saw her pleading with me through her tears. Nurse, please take care of him as if he were your own father. He's all I have in this world. I had responded with my typical professional detachment. Mom, we'll do everything medically possible. You must leave now. But what the book showed me now was what happened afterward. When I thought no one was watching, Don Julio was conscious, but very weak, and a small image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus fell into the folds of his hospital gown, which Doña Petrona had hidden there. I picked it up from the floor, ready to throw it in the trash as I always did with these contaminating items, but Don Julio looked at me with those tired eyes, full of silent supplication, and I, in a moment of weakness I never explained, folded the image and put it in his bedside table drawer instead of throwing it away. It was a small act, Jesus said, but it was love, love that acted against your own beliefs, against your intellectual pride. And look, he pointed to another section of the book, and I saw something that took my breath away, if that was even possible in my disembodied state. I saw Don Julio that very night when I had gone out to check on other patients. He took the holy card from the drawer with trembling hands, kissed it, and began to pray softly. Jesus, I know I am very sick, but I don't pray for myself, I pray for that nurse, Francisca. Lord, she has a good heart buried beneath layers of pain and disillusionment. Touch her soul, let her see your glory before it's too late. Use my life if you must, but don't let her die without knowing you. Tears began to well up in my eyes, or whatever my eyes were in that place. He prayed for me, I whispered. That dying man used his last bit of strength to pray for my atheist soul. Jesus nodded with infinite tenderness. And he wasn't the only one. Francisca, come. There's more you must see. The pages turned to another scene. March 2020, 2 months earlier of my death, an 8-year-old girl named Valeria was in my unit battling terminal leukemia and respiratory complications. I was attending to her with professional efficiency. But one night, when her parents couldn't be present due to pandemic restrictions, I heard her crying softly. I went into the room, and she asked me in a weak voice, Miss Nurse, can you sing me a song? Mom always sings to me when I'm scared. I didn't know many songs, but I remembered one my grandmother used to sing to me when I was a child, a religious song I hated because I associated it with Sunday obligations. He is my King, He is my God. He is my loving Savior. I sang that song to Valeria without really thinking about the words, just trying to calm a frightened child. She fell asleep with a smile. She died 3 days later. What the book showed me now was the moment of her death, when her little soul left her fragile body and was received into the arms of luminous angels, and I heard her childlike voice say to Jesus, Lord, the nurse who sang your song to me doesn't know you, but her heart is good. Can you save her too? I couldn't hold back my tears. Each one shook my ethereal being. They all prayed for me, I said through my tears. All the patients I despised, whose faith I considered a weakness, used their last breaths to intercede with you for my lost soul. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and that simple touch conveyed a comfort that no earthly medicine could match. True love, Francisca, isn't measured in laboratories, it doesn't appear in X-rays or blood tests, but it's the only substance in the universe that transcends death, that crosses dimensions, that opens the gates of heaven, and these children of mine loved you with pure love, expecting nothing in return. He showed me more records, a grandmother with advanced Alzheimer's named Doña Carmen, whom I allowed to listen to marimba music in the room, even though it was against the rules because the music distracts the staff. She didn't remember my name because of her condition, but every night before going to sleep she repeated the simple prayer, God bless the young woman who played my music for me, the one with sad eyes, fill her empty heart. I saw a 20-year-old who survived the pandemic in my unit, whom I scolded for having an open Bible on his table, because books accumulate germs. He hid the Bible, but continued reading passages in secret and marked Psalm 139 with a note, for Nurse Francisca, who still doesn't know that God knew her before she was born. Jesus gently closed my book and returned it to its place on the infinite shelf. Your consciousness was never the product of chemical reactions, Francisca, it is a divine breath, a spark of my own essence implanted in your being before the foundation of the world. Your brain is merely the instrument that allows that eternal consciousness to interact with the temporary material world. That is why, even though your heart has stopped for 11 minutes and 40 seconds according to earthly time, you are still you, your essence, your soul, your true consciousness is alive here, more awake than ever. I looked around the infinite library, finally grasping the magnitude of what I was witnessing. Each of those millions of books represented a soul, a complete story, an eternal record of lives lived. Is everything recorded? I asked in awe. Every thought, every intention, every act of kindness or cruelty, every word spoken in love or hate. Jesus confirmed, nothing is lost in my kingdom. The tears you wiped away, believing no one saw them, shine here like diamonds. The hugs you gave out of professional protocol, but which contain a genuine compassion, are recorded as acts of pure love, and so too are the harsh words, the cruel judgments, the pride that wounded others. It's all here, because at the end of your earthly life, every soul will face its own book and see with total clarity who it truly was. An urgent question sprang from my heart. Then, why are you showing me this? I am definitely dead. Is this my final judgment? Jesus smiled, and that smile contained mysteries my mind could not yet grasp. Not yet, my child, your time on earth is not yet over. I am showing you this because you have a purpose to fulfill. You must return and bear witness to what you have seen. Your voice, a voice that comes from science and reason, will be more powerful than 1,000 sermons when you declare that consciousness is eternal, that love transcends death, that I am real, more real than any chemical formula or mathematical equation. At that moment I felt a tug in my chest, as if an invisible cord were pulling me back. The library began to recede, the presence of Jesus to fade. Wait, I cried out, I have so many questions, I'm not ready to go back. His voice echoed one last time, remember what you have seen, Francisca, and tell my pastors, my leaders, all who teach in my name, the true science of God is love in action. Theological titles and positions of power don't matter. What counts are the records of the heart, and those cannot be faked. The tunnel of light enveloped me again, but now I was traveling in the opposite direction, returning to the world of pain, of mortal bodies, of hearts that can stop, and as I fell back into life, an absolute certainty filled my being. I had been dead, completely dead, and yet I had been more alive than ever. The pull I felt in my chest intensified, but before I could fully return to my body, Jesus stopped me in an intermediate space. We were no longer in the celestial library, but I hadn't returned to the intensive care unit either. It was like being suspended between two realities, two dimensions that coexisted but never touched. Francisca, Jesus said with a seriousness I had never heard in his voice before you return, there is something else you must understand. It was no coincidence that you worked in intensive care for 15 years, it was no accident that you cared for exactly the patients you did. Each encounter was orchestrated by my father with a twofold purpose: to bless their lives in moments of vulnerability and to prepare your hardened heart for this moment. Suddenly, the space around us transformed into something like a movie theater, but the images weren't projected on a screen. They surrounded us completely, immersive and three-dimensional. It was like being inside my own memories, but with a perspective I'd never had before. The first scene that materialized was from 5 years earlier, a Tuesday in October 2015. I immediately recognized the room. It was room 214 in the oncology ward, where I worked extra shifts to pay my apartment mortgage. There was a 40-year-old woman named Miriam Castellanos, a single mother of 3, battling stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her prognosis was terminal. We all knew it. That particular night, I was going into her room to administer morphine and monitor her vital signs. She was awake, looking out the window at the lights of Guatemala City blinking in the distance. "Nurse Francisca," she had said to me in a weak voice, "do you think there's anything after this? Do you think I'll ever see my children again, even from heaven?" I remembered my answer perfectly because I had repeated it dozens of times to other patients with the same question. "Mrs. Miriam, my job is to keep you comfortable and without pain. Existential questions are outside my area of expertise." I had been cold, clinical, professional, but what Jesus showed me now was what happened after I left that room. Miriam began to cry silently, and from the hallway I heard her sobs. I stopped. Something inside me, something I had tried to bury under layers of scientific rationalism, stirred uncomfortably. I retraced my steps, peeked my head around the door, and said, "Mrs. Miriam, if there is anything after this, I'm sure you'll be with your children. I've seen how much you love them, and that kind of love can't simply cease to exist." Jesus paused the scene just as Miriam smiled through her tears. "That moment," he said, pointing to the frozen image, "was a turning point in your soul. You acted against your own atheistic philosophy. You allowed compassion to overcome cynicism. Even if only for 30 seconds, and Miriam received those words like divine balm. She died 3 days later, but she died in peace because a skeptical nurse had given her permission to believe in eternity. Then she showed me something that broke my heart. Miriam at the moment of her death, her soul being received by radiant angelic figures, her last earthly words a prayer, "Heavenly Father, bless the nurse who said my love for my children cannot cease to exist. She doesn't know that you are love, but help her to discover it." The scene abruptly changed, and I found myself observing a moment from 2017. During Holy Week, the hospital was understaffed because most had traveled to Antigua for the processions, but I had volunteered to cover double shifts. Someone has to stay and do the real work while others chase religious fantasies, I had said. Arrogance. That night I was attending to a 65-year-old man named Rodrigo Perez, a merchant at the Central Market, who had suffered a massive heart attack. His wife and 4 children had begged permission to bring a priest to administer last rites, because Rodrigo was a devout Catholic and they wanted him to receive the final sacraments. I had flatly refused permission. "This is a hospital, not a cathedral. Mr. Perez needs absolute rest, not ceremonies that will accelerate his decline," I told them in an authoritarian tone. The family left crying, defeated by my stubbornness, but what Jesus showed me now was what I did 30 minutes later, when I thought no one was watching. Rodrigo had opened his eyes, disoriented and frightened. "Where's the priest?" he asked hoarsely. "I need to confess before I die." I adjusted his eaves, avoiding his gaze. "The priest can't come in, Mr. Rodrigo." "I'm sorry." He began to cry, silent tears rolling down his wrinkled cheeks. "Then I will die in sin. My God, forgive me." What happened next is something I had completely blocked from my conscious memory. But now I saw it with crystal clarity. I sat in the chair next to his bed, took his hand awkwardly, and said, "Don Rodrigo, I'm not religious, but my mother taught me some prayers when I was a child. If you'd like, I can pray the Lord's Prayer with you." And I did. I recited that prayer I had repeated mechanically 1,000 times in my childhood. but this time the words came out of my mouth with a strange tremor, as if something inside me recognized its power, even though my mind denied it. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, your name. Rodrigo closed his eyes, squeezed my hand, and a visible peace descended upon his face. He died 2 hours later, still holding my hand. Jesus looked at me with those eyes that contained galaxies of compassion. Francisca, that man came into my presence declaring, Lord, a nurse who doesn't believe in you prayed with me in my final hour. She is your instrument, even if she doesn't know it. Don't abandon her. My voice broke as I asked why were they praying for me when I treated them so coldly, when I openly despised their faith? Jesus answered with a question, why do you think I chose to die for humanity when humanity spat on me, beat me, and nailed me to a cross? True love doesn't expect reciprocity. Francisca loves because it is her nature to love. The next scene showed me something that brought me to my knees, or whatever the equivalent was in my spiritual state. It was February 2020, just 3 months before my death. A 16-year-old girl named Gabriela Hernandez had attempted suicide by overdosing on her mother's psychiatric pills. They brought her in by ambulance, and I was the nurse in charge of administering the medication, gastric lavage, an invasive and painful procedure. Gabriela wept hysterically, screaming that she wanted to die, that her life was meaningless, that God had abandoned her. I had followed medical protocol with surgical precision, ensuring her physical survival, but when the hospital psychologist came to assess her, I did something unusual. I told the psychologist, give me 30 minutes alone with her first. I sat beside Gabriela on the emergency room bed, this broken child who painfully reminded me of myself at that age, and I spoke to her not as a nurse, but as a woman. Gabriela, I'm not going to lecture you about God, because I myself don't know if He exists, but I am going to tell you something I do know. The pain you feel now is not permanent. The chemicals in your brain are lying to you. Give your body time to rebalance. Give your life time to change, because it will change. I promise you. What Jesus revealed to me now was that Gabriela had taken those words and repeated them like a mantra for the next few months. Not only did she survive, but she began appropriate psychiatric treatment. She reconciled with her family and found purpose in her pain. And every night, before going to sleep, she prayed, Jesus, the nurse who saved me doesn't believe in you, but you worked through her. Please save her as she saved me. At the moment I was dying in that intensive care bed, Gabriela was at home in Zone 11 of Guatemala City, awake with insomnia, feeling an inexplicable urge to pray for me. God, I don't know why, but I feel that Nurse Francisca is in danger. Protect her, please. Don't let her die without knowing you. The scenes continued to unfold one after another, an overwhelming parade of moments I had dismissed as insignificant, but which had been recorded for eternity as acts of love. I saw the day I brought sweet bread from the pastry shop to an elderly diabetic woman who technically shouldn't have eaten it, but it was her birthday and she was alone. I saw the night I allowed a father to stay past visiting hours because his 2-month-old baby was intubated, and he couldn't bear to leave him alone. I saw the afternoon I defended a new nursing assistant from the abusive shouts of an arrogant doctor, risking my own position to protect someone more vulnerable. Each of these moments, Jesus explained, were seeds of love planted in barren soil. You didn't believe in me, but I have always believed in you. I knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb. I saw your potential. I saw the compassionate heart hidden behind the defenses of intellect, and I used your profession as a nurse, a vocation you chose for selfish reasons of financial security, to transform it into a ministry of love that you didn't even recognize as such. He showed me a final scene that completely shattered me. It was my mother, Maria Elena Jimenez, kneeling in the Basilica of Esquipulas during a pilgrimage she had made 3 years earlier. I had traveled 6 hours by bus from Guatemala to that famous church, carrying a photograph of me from my nursing graduation. I saw her place the photo before the Black Christ of Esquipulas, light 3 large candles, and begin to pray with an intensity I had never witnessed. Lord of Esquipulas, miraculous Black Christ, I bring you my daughter Francisca. She has strayed from you. She says you don't exist, but I know that you have not abandoned her. I ask you with all my mother's heart, allow her to see your glory before it is too late. I offer my life in exchange for the salvation of her soul. Take me if necessary, but do not let my daughter die without knowing you." Jesus said to me in a solemn voice, "The prayers of a righteous mother can do much. Francisca, your mother has interceded for you for decades, but especially in the last 3 years. Every rosary she prayed, every candle she lit, every tear she shed was a cry that reached directly to my Father's throne. And when you contracted the pandemic, when your heart stopped in that intensive care bed, all those accumulated prayers became a wall of protection around your soul. The prayers you ignored were the ones that saved you." I couldn't stop crying. My entire universe of scientific certainties had crumbled, and in its place was a truth so simple and so powerful that I wondered how I had been so blind for 37 years. Love is the only real force in the universe, not mathematical equations, not the laws of physics, not medical protocols. Love that prays for enemies, love that intercedes for the lost, love that never gives up, even when rejected 1,000 times. "You have a choice to make," Jesus said, his voice now serious and urgent. "You can stay here with me in eternal peace, without pain, without struggle, or you can return to your body, experience the pain of resurrection, and live with a purpose I am now entrusting to you. If you return, you must be my witness. You will have to tell pastors, religious leaders, believers, and atheists alike, the true science of God is love in action. Theological degrees and doctorates don't matter. It doesn't matter how many verses you memorize or how many hours you preach from elegant pulpits. The only thing that counts in my kingdom is the record of the heart, and those cannot be faked." He showed me a vision of pastors being turned away at the gates of heaven, famous pastors with megachurches and television shows shouting, "But, Lord, we prophesied in your name, we performed miracles, we built empires for your glory," and Jesus, answering them with infinite sadness, "I never knew you. You used my name to enrich yourselves, to gain power, to feed your egos. Your heavenly records are empty of true love." Then he showed me the opposite vision, ordinary, unknown people entering heaven with joy because their records shone with acts of genuine love. A woman who had cleaned bathrooms in a hospital for 40 years, blessing each bathroom she cleaned with prayers. A man who had distributed bread to the homeless his entire life, without cameras, without recognition, only pure love. "What is your decision, Francisca?" Jesus asked, and although every fiber of my being wanted to remain in that indescribable peace, I knew my answer. "I want to return, Lord. I want to tell the world that you are real, that conscience is eternal, that love transcends death, that everything is recorded. I want to warn the false teachers and encourage the true servants. I want to embrace my mother and ask her forgiveness for 30 years of arrogance." Jesus smiled and placed his hand on my forehead. "Then return, my daughter, and always remember, I was with you even when you denied my existence. You were never alone." The return was brutal. There is no other word to describe it. When the soul leaves the body, it's like taking off a heavy suit and breathing freely for the first time. But returning to the body after experiencing heavenly freedom is like being forced into a prison of flesh that hurts, that weighs, that confines. I felt the impact as if I were falling from a 20-story building directly onto concrete. An explosive pain ripped through my chest. Exactly where Drive Hernandez had been doing chest compressions, my lungs, which had been collapsed and filled with fluid, suddenly tried to expand against the fractured ribs. It was pure agony. I heard the beep of the heart monitor change from that continuous, flat sound of death to an irregular, erratic beep that gradually began to stabilize into the recognizable sinus rhythm. "We have a pulse, Drive," Morales shouted with a mixture of disbelief and professional relief. "Sinus rhythm, heart rate 85, blood pressure recovering." Drive Hernandez stopped compressions and slumped against the wall, exhausted, his surgical gown soaked in sweat. Vilma wept openly, her trembling hands adjusting my ears. "Boss, he's back. Oh my God, he's back." I tried to open my eyes. but it was as if my eyelids weighed tons. The endotracheal tube in my throat made me gag terribly. I wanted to rip it out. I needed to speak. I had to tell them what I had seen, but my body wouldn't obey me. I was trapped inside myself, conscious, but unable to communicate. I heard everything with supernatural clarity. Drive. Morales ordering immediate neurological tests to check for brain damage. After 12 minutes without oxygen. Drive. Hernandez murmuring softly, "It's a medical miracle. I shouldn't have brain activity after that long." And Vilma, my sweet Vilma, whispering a prayer of thanks. "Thank you, Virgin of Guadalupe, thank you, Lord Jesus." I knew he wouldn't take her yet. The next 3 days were a hazy mix of physical pain and spiritual clarity. I was kept sedated most of the time so my body could recover from the massive trauma, but each time I briefly emerged from sedation, in those moments between sleep and wakefulness, I saw things I would have previously dismissed as drug-induced hallucinations. I saw luminous figures standing beside the beds of other patients in intensive care, angels, I knew instinctively. Some stood in protective guard positions, others wore expressions of sorrow because they knew that patient wouldn't survive and were preparing to escort them to the other side. Beside the bed of Don Julio Mendizábal, who was miraculously still battling the sickness in room 7, I saw a particularly bright presence. It was enormous, at least 3 meters tall, with wings that weren't physical, but made of pure light, and I recognized with amazement that this angel had been there all the time. During all those months that I had cared for it with professional detachment, protecting it, sustaining it, answering Doña Petrona's prayers, which I had dismissed as ignorant superstition. On the 4th day, the medical team decided to extubate me. They had performed every possible neurological examination, MRIs, CT scans, electroencephalograms. The results left them perplexed. 0 brain damage, no cognitive impairment. All the specialists agreed that it was medically inexplicable. 12 minutes without oxygen should have caused severe and irreversible brain damage. The neurologist, Drive, Cifuentes, kept repeating, scratching his head as he looked at the results, but his scans showed a completely normal brain, as if I had never been in cardiac arrest. When they finally removed the tube and I could speak, my first words were, "I need to see my mother." Drive. Morales smiled with tears in her eyes. "Your mother has been camped out in the waiting room for 4 days without moving. We couldn't convince her to go home, not even to sleep. They made an exception to the visiting rules and allowed Mum in for 10 minutes, fully equipped with a protective suit, mask, and face shield. When I saw her walk through the door of the intensive care unit, my heart broke into 1,000 pieces." Maria Elena Jimenez, my 62-year-old mother, looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen her 2 months ago. Her hair, which she always kept dyed black, now showed completely gray roots. She had deep dark circles under her eyes and had noticeably lost weight, but in her eyes shone something I hadn't seen in years, hope mixed with unwavering faith. She approached my bed trembling. She took my hand carefully, as if I were made of glass, and simply wept. "Mom," I said, my voice hoarse from the tube that had been in my throat for days, "you were right. God is real, Jesus is real, heaven is real. I saw everything, Mom, and I saw your prayers, each one shining like stars in the sky." Mom let out a sob that came from the depths of her soul. "Daughter, my child, I knew he would touch you. I never lost faith, never." We hugged, and in that hug were 30 years of reconciled arguments, of healed pain, of love that could finally flow without the barriers of intellectual pride I had built. I told her everything, every detail of my experience, the tunnel of light, the encounter with Jesus, the library of souls, the eternal records, the revelations about the patients who prayed for me,